Good evening. I want to welcome you here to the Anglican Parish of St. Paul in the Anglican Diocese of Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. My name is Myron Penner. I am the rector here at St. Paul's, and I want to welcome you to our Lenten sessions. This is our final Lenten session with Professor Douglas Herink, who is the Professor Emeritus of Theology at the King's University here in Edmonton, Alberta. He's written a fascinating book looking at the concept of justice in Paul's letter to the Romans. The name of this book is Resurrecting Justice, Reading Romans for the Life of the World, and we've had some great conversations, and we're joined this evening with the Venerable Jordan Haney-Ware, who is in our diocese as an Archdeacon of Social Justice and Community Networking.
Community Connection.
Community Connection. And she's also the rector at the Parish of the Good Shepherd. But she was able to be with us for 2 sessions, and then she had other commitments, but has now rejoined us, and we're very happy to have you with us again, Jordan, for this.
Glad to be back.
And we are looking at the last section of Doug's book, which is also the last section of the Paul's letter to the Romans. And so we'll be looking at Romans chapters 12, 14 to 16. Right, Romans 12, so we're skipping 13.
Roughly.
Romans 12, and then roughly, very roughly. There's no way we can do justice to any of this. But I want to also let you know, those of you who are watching, that you can text in comments by typing questions and comments on Facebook. I have my phone here, and I will look at the comments section in Facebook, and we'll get to it when we can. Sometimes the flow of conversation means that I'll have to address it at a later time. There's also a slight lag, so you just need to be aware of that. But please, if you have something that sparks your interest, something you want to say, something you want to ask, either Doug or me or Jordan, please just type that in there and we'll get to it when we can. But I'm going to turn it over to Doug now, and he's going to sort of set up the evening in terms of where our conversation is going to go, and then we'll just sort of see how things progress from there.
Thanks, Myron. So what I want to do first of all is just, I don't want to recap because there's 11 chapters of a lot of complex material that we've already covered, so I don't want to recap per se. What I want to do is say that within those first 11 chapters, I said this in the very first session, Paul is basically, has taken up the task of redescribing the real. And certainly this redescription of the real is most fundamentally important for the Gentile peoples. For them, the real was made up of, their various gods and lords and powers in the universe and so on, and all of the things that they felt was necessary, were necessary to get these gods on their side, okay? So there were the gods of Rome, but there were also many other gods of various cities and trades and household gods and so on. And so it was a polytheistic environment, but of course, these gods weren't just up there in the air, as it were. They were also very much present in, let's say, the power of the Roman Empire, okay? The Roman Empire existed, according to our understanding of reality. The Roman Empire existed and had its capacity to do what it did because the gods of Rome were on Rome's side, okay? And so the whole universe and the gods, the whole divine realm needed to be reimagined by these Gentile believers. And so I believe what Paul is doing in the first 11 chapters, certainly the first 8, he's doing something a bit different in chapters 9 to 11, which we went over last week. But certainly in those first 8 chapters, he's engaged in that entire redescription of God, the cosmos, human being, and everything, okay? So it's a massive task that Paul undertakes when you think of the task, in relatively short space, right?
Yeah.
So, but in some ways it's simple too, because for Paul, all of reality now is determined by the reality of the God who is incarnate in the person of Jesus Christ and who has communicated his own divine power to those believers in the Holy Spirit. In some sense, that kind of sums up the whole of those first 8 chapters. So,
And I like the word that you use throughout this, which I know you got from J. Lewis Martin. But Paul has been apocalypsed.
yes,
Like he has been, like his whole world has come to an end and has been rebooted.
exactly.
And I just don't think it's easy for me, who grew up in the church, who was led through Sunday school. I was in an evangelical tradition.
Yep.
I was led through the sinner's prayer and accepted Christ as my Savior and Lord and all that stuff. Jesus has been a friend of mine since before I can remember.
Right.
And it's easy for me to just think of that as one other thing that's part of my identity. But for Paul, this changed everything in the world, and there could be no bigger thing that could ever possibly even be imagined.
Exactly.
That's the thing that
Than
really,
which nothing greater can be thought, according to St. Anselm.
yeah, exactly. Sorry for interrupting. It's
No,
just that, like, it's just I've been really struck by just for how for Paul this is the all-encompassing, determinative reality for everything, and he's almost like banging his head, saying, "Can't you guys see this?"
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And so to reinsert the word apocalypse into the whole conversation is important, because, of course, for Paul, all of this comes about because of that apocalypse to him, that revelation to him of the risen Jesus Christ.
Right.
That's what fundamentally alters everything for Paul. And interestingly, so I've spoken about how it alters the whole Gentile imagination of what the universe is and who the gods are and so on. But it also alters Paul's imagination with respect to his Judaism. I mean, there are certainly some things that that Paul is fundamentally grounded in, the one God of Israel. No change there, okay? Even this God who has persistently and consistently revealed himself to Israel, okay? So in that sense, you could say that God apocalypses, that God reveals himself, is not a new thought for Paul. What's new for Paul, of course, is that God reveals himself in Jesus of Nazareth, who is crucified. And so at the very heart of this radical redescription of reality for Paul is the fact that God, the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, takes up human flesh, enters into the human scene, into its very depths, and is brought to an end by sinful humankind. So for Paul, it all focuses finally on the crucifixion and then, of course, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So just that as in a sense, summing up those first 11 chapters. And that's why when we get to chapter 12, verse 1, Paul says, therefore, I appeal to you, therefore, on the basis of God's mercies. And that's also an interesting thought, because there's a sense in which the language of God's mercy kind of concludes Paul's entire discussion in Romans 9 to 11, okay? God will have mercy on all. And so now Paul says, look, in view of God's mercy, there's a sense in which that entire stretch of chapters that basically are proclaiming God's justice, Paul now turns into the word mercy. In other words, God's justice can just as fairly be called God's mercy, okay? So in view of God's mercies, Paul appeals to his readers, probably more directly appeals to those people, those few congregations in Rome that are hearing this letter read. He makes his appeal to them. What kind of life is taken up, as it were,
Right.
In this new reality? And so that becomes now Paul's task. What does life look like in this new reality? What's its shape? Okay, we've already noticed a couple of things. Number one, its shape is fundamentally trust, okay?
Right.
That's the first thing that Paul speaks about with respect to Abraham. Secondly, it's sharing in or participation or becoming one with the Messiah. So that's the second dimension. And thirdly, it is the receiving of the Spirit, which draws these listeners into that reality. So it's the Holy Spirit that takes these believers up into the reality of Jesus Christ and effectively enables their trust in the justice of God and Jesus Christ.
It's remarkably passive in some ways.
It's passive, yeah.
Or you're adopting a response posture to God's
That-
pre-existing action.
I prefer that language of response. It's interestingly in 2 Corinthians 5, Paul kind of, as it were, lays out the gospel. He says, "One has died for all, therefore all have died. Therefore let those who live no longer for themselves, but for the one who died." So it's a call to life. But you're exactly right to emphasize the priority of God in all of this, the priority of God's action. So this is one thing I think is so core to understanding Paul. God does, God acts, God takes the initiative, God brings about the reality of justice, God brings about the reality of reconciliation, and because of that, we are called to live in that reality. But the living then is that's why I'm a little resistant to the idea of passive. The living is a kind of living into and living out of, so it's always a call to life.
No, that's true. I guess I feel like so often Christians and churches get associated with sort of laundry lists of things to do.
Yeah, good point.
Or things not to do, perhaps. And that has never really been my read of Paul.
Right.
And it seems as though it's much more God has done. I
Absolutely.
appeal to you, therefore, by the mercies of God.
Yes.
Absolutely,
And
yeah.
it's not sort of, well, here, you've got to do X, Y, and Z
Yeah.
before God will love you
Yeah.
or accept you or anything like that.
Do all these things because somehow out of your own initiative, these are the good things to do.
And you'll somehow get your ticket.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I lost the thought.
Oh,
Never
sorry.
mind. No, that's okay. I was just thinking along the lines of what you were saying, but fair enough. Let's carry on. So the call to life, interestingly, for Paul, is a call to bodily life. Okay,
Yes.
it's life. It's the life of the body, and so the first thing Paul says is, "I appeal to you to give yourselves as living sacrifices." Okay.
And by body, you don't mean like corporate church. You mean physical. Well, I think his concept of the body was more than physical, but he means with your person,
With your whole person.
including your physical body.
I'm probably skipping ahead, but I love the emphasis that you place on the table and table fellowship
Yeah,
as
we're getting
being
there.
critical because it is so bodily the way that we eat and drink together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I found that maybe even more poignant in this pandemic time when we can't share food.
Yeah, that's a good
And
point.
we can't, like, not even just
Can't
the
even the
Eucharist,
Yeah,
but
that's true.
also, just potlucks and,
Yeah.
and sharing a meal together. To me,
Yeah.
that's so critical to forming a community
Mhm.
and clearly to Paul as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we're missing it right now.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right, and we'll get to that because I think another thing I want to bring out then, of course, is that eating and drinking or food is more than eating and drinking, just as the body is in some ways more than the body. But
yeah.
but this call to active living, what Paul calls a living sacrifice, is a call to, as it were, put our bodies on the line. Okay.
Yeah.
So, by the way, I just thought of the thought I had earlier, and I want to just bring this up. A lot of people probably read through the first 11 chapters of Romans, and often their minds are boggled. Okay, fair enough. Some of it's difficult, and especially Romans 9 to 11. And so they get to Romans chapter 12 and they say, well, here we've got things to do, okay? And so I think a lot of people, maybe in their readings of Romans, just skip over those first 11 chapters and get to chapter 12 because it's all pretty straightforward, okay? Anyway, that's just referring to your note a little earlier.
Yeah.
Okay, so bodies, and I find this interesting. Our response is not, as we often think of, if we're thinking religiously, our response to God's claim on our life is a spiritual response. Okay, and I'm not denying that we are spirit, body, soul, this entire entity. Okay, this whole entity. But but I think we often have this temptation to separate out the spiritual from the bodily. Paul is all about the body. If you read 1 Corinthians, the entire letter is about the body.
Oh my gosh. Yes.
Personal bodies, corporate bodies, dead bodies, living bodies, resurrected bodies. It's
Immortal
all about bodies. Sorry?
Immortal
bodies, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, who'd have thought bodies would become immortal, right? He doesn't talk about immortal souls.
No.
He talks about bodies receiving immortality. But anyway, so I just
receiving it, not having
receiving it,
natively.
exactly. Yeah, they're not.
That's an important
There's
point.
no intrinsic immortality,
Yeah.
right?
I have a friend who recently shared on social media. She was, or not recently, pre-pandemic, she was asked on a plane, if you die tonight, where will your immortal soul be? And she said, well, hopefully with my resurrected body.
Good one, yeah.
Which is a good response.
And the person was flabbergasted. But anyway.
Okay. So I want to emphasize that, so that even, and I tried to point this out way back in chapter 4 of Romans, when Abraham trusts God, he trusts God with his body, okay? A body that by then, Paul says, was as good as dead. Nevertheless, Abraham puts his body on the line, gets up from Haran, and walks toward Canaan. So trust is a bodily thing. It's a living, wholehearted, active self-offering, okay? A living sacrifice, Paul calls it. But it's also a corporate thing. And this is in the next section in Romans chapter 12, where Paul says, we individually are parts of a body which is greater than us, namely the Messiah's body, okay? You could say the Messiah's body is always growing. Whenever a believer puts their body on the line as a living sacrifice, they're being taken up into Messiah's body in the world. And so Paul has this expansive notion of the body. And so it's a personal body, we could say, but it's also a corporate body, a community that he's thinking about. If I can just say one thing then about spiritual, okay? We get this phrase, I remember this verse from the King James Version, okay? I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your reasonable worship?
Acts of worship.
Reasonable worship or something like that.
Reasonable, yeah.
But I love the way they had the word reasonable in there.
I do too.
The NRSV translates that word logikane, from which we get our word logic.
Yeah.
Right.
Translated as a spiritual worship.
No. It's not a good translation.
Anyway, I'll pick up that thought. But when you see the word spiritual worship, I don't know how the NIV translates this.
I think it's your spiritual act of worship.
Spiritual act of worship. But
I think so.
Forget about the spiritual, okay? I'm just saying that. Christians are way too concerned about the spiritual. It's about bodies and minds. That's what Paul actually is talking about in this text. Okay. You had a comment.
I wanted to ask, I think this is related to the question that's on the screen here. They're following up from last week about the concept of messianic anarchy and not pledging allegiance to any secular government or political structure. Does that apply to the structure of the church? And from what you've been saying about the body, the Messiah body that is the church, I want to say no, but obviously there are some human imposed structures within the church that make me want to say yes. So I'm curious about your response to this.
This is Barry Reed, and here's what he also goes on to say. So they couldn't put it all up on the screen at once. So he goes, that is, after that question, should Christians not pledge allegiance to a particular church structure, doctrine, or set of beliefs? Should we also practice messianic anarchy when Christian leaders tell us that membership in a particular church or that participating in the Eucharist, etc., is required for our salvation? He kind of muddied the waters there at the very end, didn't he?
Yeah. You know, maybe I'll tackle that if we have a chance when we get to chapter 14.
Sure.
Okay.
I mean, every living social body ends up with a kind of structure. There's no question about that. But, you know, we do not pledge allegiance to a political structure. We pledge allegiance to a Lord, okay, to our sovereign Jesus Christ. And everything that happens within the body of Christ must be an outworking of that allegiance and must take the shape of the Messiah, okay? So you cannot have, I'm not saying you can't have a hierarchy in the church, but you cannot have a hierarchy in the church that functions in the same way that social and political hierarchies function in the world.
Right.
Which is why on Maundy Thursday, the priest and the bishop wash the feet of the people, right?
So
Because this is how Christ showed his love, and he did not lord it over them the way the Gentiles lorded over you.
exactly. That's exactly right. So
And yet, anyone who's read any Trollope novels knows perfectly well that there are plenty of Anglican bishops and clergy who have lorded it over people.
there are plenty of Christian leaders in any in any and every denomination, and no denomination at all but your local independent church, who lord it over their people. All of this in fundamental contradiction of the one whom they call Lord. So,
well, and I would say what I hear you saying is our allegiance is never to a church. The church exists because we have an allegiance to something else.
that's right.
Which is to Jesus Christ, which in a sense places a radical brackets or question mark over all of the other things that we think go into that, because everything else is now relative to that. So
Exactly.
we are committed to the church insofar as it is actually an expression of that lordship of Jesus Christ, and when it fails to do that, we can no longer affirm it.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
Exactly
and I
right.
think
Yeah.
that's what you would. That's how what I hear you saying.
No,
So,
that's exactly right. I mean,
like
insofar as leadership in the church takes the form of worldly leadership, which seeks its own advantage and its own interests, its own agendas, and its own ruling over other people, it is a fundamental contradiction of the reality of Jesus Christ.
And you have proven yourself in that instance not to actually be the thing that you said
Exactly.
you
Yeah. I mean, you get a good example in 1 Corinthians, where Paul addresses the question of the Lord's Supper. There, as I understand it, the people in Corinth are gathering together in their house churches, likely in the house of someone who is a little more wealthy and has the space to host them. And it turns out that the wealthy people, it appears that the wealthy people in the church are gathering together earlier, eating the food and getting drunk, and then the poorer people are arriving later and are effectively being humiliated in this scene. And Paul says, you know what? If that's the way you're celebrating the Lord's Supper, it's not the Lord's Supper you're celebrating.
Exactly.
Okay?
That's right.
Because how you're acting in that context is a fundamental contradiction of what you're saying you're celebrating in the Lord's Supper.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the same with respect to church leadership. And so thanks for the question, because I think it is relevant to what goes on in Romans 12, let's say from verses 3 down to 8 or something like that, where Paul basically speaks about everyone being given the grace of God in the form of gifts for the building up of the whole.
Mm-hmm.
And every activity of each member in the corporate body of Christ, every bodily activity of the corporate members of the body of Christ, of members of the corporate body of Christ, are done in order to serve that body as a whole for the building up of the body and for the building up of other persons. Paul says, I think he says it here, honor the other as greater than yourself.
Yes.
Okay? Now the fact is, if you're on the bottom end of the social scale, you're always doing that anyway. So in some respects, this is not an instruction to them.
Right.
It is an instruction to those on the top of the social heap.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Your job, you at the top of the social heap, is to honor the lowly. And he has this a number of instructions in here about the relationship of the lowly, and do not regard yourself higher than you ought to. Okay, even your faith, he says, is given to you by God. How can you think that you have more faith or a better faith or something like that than somebody else gathered in this community?
No.
So it's a radical subversion of the typical social hierarchies you get in any given community.
Stephen Backhouse was here doing were you here for this, Myron, when he did a clergy day? And he argued that it's even much more scandalous than what even you're saying, which is quite scandalous, but that the idea
I'm happy to be out scandalized, but go ahead.
but essentially at that time, if you give honor to other people, it's a zero-sum game. So that takes honor away from yourself. So persons of a higher social class would never give any of their honor away to a person of a lower social class. And when he said that, that was just so shocking to me.
Sure.
That society would be that way, that to be kind to other people or to honor other people or praise other people who were of lower social class, that would be viewed as like I was losing.
It's unthinkable.
Or even peers.
Even peers, yeah. You
very
can
tricky with your
only
peers.
honor people
when
above
it's clear that you have to.
Yeah, and you know the only reason you don't want to just paint everybody with the same brush, but the primary reason why most wealthy people would give money to some kind of build a temple or some kind of structure or some kind of service in the city was so that they would receive ever more praise and honor. Okay,
Right.
Yeah.
It was all about buying honor from people. So
That
so
never
the very
happens
thought-
in our church capital campaigns, ever.
Ever? No.
I was going to say,
Everybody
thinking
puts in
about-
all the money and remains anonymous.
Yeah,
Is that
nobody wants a special brick.
correct?
no.
Okay, let's
Anyways.
carry on.
We need to go.
Okay, so then Paul speaks. I want to pick up again on. Well, I want to say two things. First of all, it's interesting in those first two verses how Paul uses strong liturgical language. Okay, he uses the language of living sacrifice. Okay, that's a liturgical thought. He uses the language later on of rational or what I would call reasonable worship. So the whole of life that comes into being, that is called into being in the light of the gospel, is a life of worship, okay? Bodily worship. So Paul sees the whole life of the congregation in their mutual upbuilding and in their life together and in their sharing of funds that we'll get into in just a minute, and those kinds of things. All of this is their reasonable worship, their reasonable sacrifice to God. So I think that's an important thing to emphasize. This is liturgical language, this is worship language that Paul is bringing into the conversation here.
And he's mixing that with social life.
Yes, absolutely.
It's not like there's liturgy in church and then there's what you do when you leave. No. Like that, it is. And this is what I constantly try to tell people in our parish is that this is just like the start of the liturgy, because the liturgy extends all the way around the week until we come back.
Yeah. Yeah, and in my book, I toward the latter part of chapter 12, I speak about messianic life on the streets and in the neighborhoods. But all of this is part of that living sacrifice and that reasonable worship which is being offered in this context. Yeah.
There was a church I went to once in Waco, Texas, and they had a little plaque at the back of the church. And as you come in, it says, prayer is work. And then as you leave, it says work is prayer.
Nice.
And so it very much is calling that to mind, that as you come in, that you are working, you are laboring on behalf of the world with your prayers. And then as you leave, that work continues and it doesn't stop.
Yeah,
and
that's
I
great.
refer to it all the time. I love that plaque.
Yeah, I like that too.
It's great. Okay, well, and the last part, and we're still only in the first two verses, although I referred to others. But
one of the four chapters.
but Paul brings in these two: do not be conformed to this world, or do not be subordinated to the scheme of this age. Effectively, is what Paul says there. Well, this age for Paul is everything that precedes the arrival of this new reality in Jesus Christ. Don't be conformed to that, or don't be subordinated or be submissive to that, but rather be transformed by the renewing of your mind. These two verses are very famous, and many people memorize these two verses. And in some ways, they're kind of the fundamental structure of the Christian life. These are two great verses to memorize. But one thing I do want to emphasize here is Paul uses mind language and thinking language. And here again, I want to just kind of guard against the notion that somehow or other we can carry on our Christian lives unthinkingly, okay? We are constantly being required to reimagine our lives in the reality of the gospel. And that means that we have to learn the reality of the gospel. It means we have to read the gospels. But it also means we have to read really difficult texts like Romans 1 to 11 and commit ourselves as much as we are capable of to thinking through these texts and then to thinking through our lives in relation to these texts. Paul is speaking about a transformation that rests in some significant sense in a renewing of the mind, okay? In renewed thought, in a renewed imagination of the world.
And he doesn't just have the idea that you know, God gives some people to do that. That thinking stuff, and then the rest of us. I mean, there is definitely in Paul a sense in which God gifts people variously for different acts of service within the body, and that would definitely be one of the capacities. But he's talking here to craftsmen.
I know.
He's not talking
and some slaves. And
he's not talking to converted rabbis.
That's right.
In all likelihood, right?
Exactly.
And people who would be, you know, philosophically and rhetorically trained like he was.
That's right. In fact, you can probably, it's probably pretty safe to say that virtually no one or very, very few people in the congregations that are getting this letter in the first instance have much formal education. They certainly don't have university degrees. They're not rabbis. They're just ordinary people, possibly ordinary, pretty much uneducated people.
Working class people.
Which is why I'm really glad that you're sort of unpacking this intellectual word that you use on page 164, because I had put a question mark next to it.
Okay.
Because I do think that can be intimidating for folks today who don't have university degrees and who maybe feel, I remember once being a guest on a podcast and the person was sort of saying, well, it seems like you're asking a lot of your average Joe reading the Bible, and it's much easier to just trust my pastor or trust, you know, this televangelist or my podcast or whatever. And I was like, no, you do have to engage with the Bible. And so I really did struggle with this idea of intellectual, because I really wanted it to be more about the heart and the body, but you're integrating this in such a clear way here that I'm like, okay, now I'm following what Doug means by this passage.
This even ties in later, and you might get to that, but when Paul talks about convictions, he's not giving anyone a free pass. Like, okay, those guys figured it out, you just go with them. No, like each of you need to figure out where your convictions lie on this. Where do you stand between you and God through the Holy Spirit on this issue, and then you live in that. On
what you're eating.
Yeah.
Exactly.
On difficult theological stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, we might look at that and say dietary laws.
Yeah, no, it was much more. I mean, there were whole visions of reality embodied in food.
And you do a great job with that. I don't want to preempt you, but
we'll get to that. But no, I appreciate that. Now, to a certain extent, obviously the congregants who are listening to this letter have to, in some sense, trust. And I think I mentioned maybe in the first session or so, I think Phoebe, the one who bears this letter. So this is a woman, by the way. Okay, Phoebe is a woman, not a man. Maybe you're aware of that. But this is a woman who bears this letter to the Romans. She probably reads it to them, and quite likely over several weeks, possibly over a couple months, unpacks the meaning,
interprets it
of this letter for them. So in that sense, Paul isn't just, as it were, throwing this rather demanding treatise at them and saying, make some sense of it. No, I think Paul commissions Phoebe to go and effectively teach, unpack this material for this church. I think he's probably pretty aware of the fact that there are many people in those congregations in Rome who can't read, number one, and for whom the reading of the text to them is core to the whole procedure, but secondly, who just wouldn't be able to follow the argument without some real help. So it would be necessary in some sense to trust a good teacher, but I do think that Paul wants them to hear the text, absolutely, and to make their way as much as possible into, let's face it, a lot of uneducated people can think their way very well into texts and so on. So just because they aren't formally educated doesn't mean they're not smart, right?
Wasn't it you guys in our very first week, you were talking about some Austrian farmer who refused to fight for the Nazis?
Yeah.
And, he was not an intellectual, not educated in any particular way. He wasn't a priest or a bishop sort of preaching against Nazism. He just was a man who, when they called, he said no.
That's right.
And then he was killed for it, wasn't he?
Yeah. By the way, if you want a perfect example of what it means to live in relation to the governing authorities, the way I think Paul does it, the movie is called A Hidden Life. Find it on Netflix, find it somewhere, but watch the movie A Hidden Life. It will be a deeply challenging movie for Christians to watch, for sure.
Yeah, and my point on this earlier thing that you were talking about with, they needed people to do this. I mean, what you see, I think, in Paul here is he's basically saying we all start at different places, but the point is we grow.
Yes.
Right? And so there's this sense of you need to be, I love C.S. Lewis's phrase, further up and further in.
Yeah.
Right? We need to constantly be moving further up and further into this life that the Holy Spirit has caught us up into in the blessed communion of the Holy Trinity, right?
Exactly.
And so there's no sense of, wow, that's for somebody else.
Right.
I'll just keep planting my potatoes.
Right, exactly. And this farmer doesn't need a master's in Greek and Hebrew to read his scriptures and see that Nazism is completely incompatible with it.
Yeah, that's
he is
right.
able to make rigorous intellectual working out of his faith with fear and trembling and to come to this conviction and this conclusion.
Yeah.
And not
even
defer
though
that.
it costs him his life.
Yeah.
And so it's not, just because it's intellectual doesn't mean that it's for university professors or
and formal
pastors.
academic theology.
Right.
That's right. That's right. No, 100%. Okay. Here I just basically want to take a look at, well, I've already basically said this, the formation of what I call a new body politic, okay? So what's the alternative to living according to and being conformed to the spirit of this age or the scheme of this age? Well, it is the shaping of a new body politic. There's no question that social and economic and political pressures are always being put on us, including as well as cultural pressures and so on. And so what's necessary is the formation of a new social and political body in the world, one that is able to sustain the convictions about this new reality. That needs to be done amongst other people. It needs to be done with other people. It needs to be done with people committed to building one another up in this new vision. Okay, so and so I just want to emphasize that I think that's a good deal of what goes on in the second half of Romans chapter 12. The formation of a new body politic in the world, and it's the Messiah's body. It's living. It's graceful, it's spirit-moved, it's grounded in love for one another and mutual honor. So here we come back to the honor question again. Economic sharing, and so there's so I believe there's economic sharing both within these communities and between these communities and other ones. And I talk a lot about what's called the collection. Maybe you want to just raise this question, but for Paul, one of Paul's, besides going out and preaching the good news to as many people as possible, the other thing that Paul was engaged in was taking up a collection from the Gentile churches that he could take with him back to Jerusalem. Paul is basically writing this letter in a space of time between one of his missionary trips on the one hand, a desire to go to Rome on the other hand, but this intention to go back to Jerusalem with probably what was quite a sum of money that he'd collected from the Gentile churches to bring back to Jerusalem. And for Paul, again, this economic act, this act of real monetary sharing between Gentiles and Jews was one of those concrete, visible signs that God was at work reconciling Gentiles and Jews to one another, reconciling Israel and the nations. Yeah.
And go ahead, Myron.
Well, I just to sort of, I guess, riff off of that a little bit, I just find it incredibly important that I think, maybe I'll back up. I think sometimes we think that Paul's missionary effort was just all about giving the gospel, and the gospel was a story or a set of, spiritual laws sometimes, and then he just told people, this is what you do, and this is what you believe, and then you believe in Jesus, and it's all. But what he's actually, it's far more organic, and I kind of look at, using Paul's concept, because I refuse to call it a metaphor, of the body of Christ, I look at these as actually establishing like these sinews in the body, that these ties that are literal concrete like avenues or connections, right? And for me, this kind of touches I guess because as you both know, I've spent some time outside of Canada doing work in human development as a Christian, building the church, and there's criticism that comes from that, right? Why are you doing that? There's so many people. But this has always been the case with Christians, where we're not ever just looking at our little insular local church or something like that. We're always concerned about how people around the world are doing, and the Spirit is calling us across the globe, not just in our own little place. And there are concrete, practical ways in which we are I guess, tying ourselves to the body that you're talking about of Christ that exists around the world.
And so you never get in Paul any kind of divorce or separation between what we call evangelism and social action.
Right.
For Paul, the good news generates all kinds of things: hospitality, economic sharing. Read Acts 2 and Acts 4. What's the first thing that gospel brings about when it's preached to people in Jerusalem? It brings about economic sharing.
Everybody holds everything in common.
Everybody holds everything in common.
According to
brings about Christian communism.
Brings about Christian communism. But I want to go to this point here on page 212, if I may. Because you make this claim: the collection was material evidence that God's justice in Messiah was bringing forth justice in the relationship between the Gentile peoples and the Judeans. And to me, this is particularly significant, especially now that we have 2 centuries of anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism in Christian empire, essentially. But even at that time, the Gentile peoples had already committed terrible sins against the Judeans. And so when I read it, my immediate thought was, is this reparations, essentially? And so God, according to this, it seems to me as though God is using money paid in recompense for these sins committed as a material evidence of reconciling or bringing justice to this right relationship, essentially.
Yeah, and as I said to Jordan, we had a bit of this conversation beforehand. I think this is a brilliant way of reading that particular thought. It's not something I had in mind, I have to say, but to think in terms of reparations, because the problem with the believers in Jerusalem was that there was a famine, okay? But famines are never just natural events.
Right.
No.
Okay?
Especially when there are some people eating somewhere else.
Exactly. They are social, economic, and political events. And so some people are always starving, not simply because there hasn't been rain, but because other people are hoarding what's there.
Yes.
Okay, and so to say, well, is this an act of reparation that the Gentile believers, who are part of Rome, part of the Roman Empire, they are in that sense Romans, have been the oppressors of the Judean people for a century now, okay, by Paul's time. Is this a way in which they can signal that they recognize something of the mistreatment? By the way, Paul in Romans chapter 11 says to the Gentiles, look, don't have this superior attitude toward the Judeans, because which they always did, right? So there's a lot going on when Paul takes up this collection. And one of these things may be reparations, but clearly also a signal from the Gentile people that they are now going to honor the Judean people with this economic sharing, and to lift them up and to build them up. So I really appreciated that thought. Is this reparations? I think it might well be part of what Paul has in mind.
And it seems to me also that you're using this word signal a lot, and what that is bringing up for me is almost signaling an alliance or an allegiance with these oppressed people, as opposed to with your sort of natural ethnic heritage or your birthright as a Roman citizen. And so similarly, reparations in a modern context would signal an allegiance with whomever one is paying reparations to, whether that's in the States when people are talking about paying reparations to descendants of slaves, some of the financial arrangements and agreements here regarding settlements for residential schools or various other sins committed against the First Nations of Canada, and signaling allegiance with and brotherhood, brotherly love with those communities, as opposed to status seeking, or, well, this money is mine and I'm going to use it to do this status chasing that would be quite common in our own modern time as well as in the Romans' time.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah, and I think we have to always keep in mind that in the first century here, they didn't have this whole culture of charity that we have now. They didn't get income tax deductions because they did this, and that you didn't. You're alluding to these reconfigured social relationships, right? They were being asked to treat. They weren't being asked. They were actually doing. They were treating these people as if they were part of their in-group. Which was cutting across all the hierarchies of the social structure, and was threatening it, actually. I mean, Rome and society in that time was built on, this was the glue that cemented, or the backbone that kept it running, is that the people at the top got the honor from the people at the bottom.
That's right.
And it went all the way up the chain.
And that's the way it should be.
And if it doesn't, we don't work. We don't function.
That's right. Yeah, and this is...
and they're cutting across all of that, and they're saying, I will treat you as if you are part of me and I am part of you, which has echoes, of course, of, he who doesn't hate his father and mother can't take up his cross and follow me, and so on.
Yeah, and so these... so when Paul asks his readers and his hearers to reimagine the world, this is where that reimagination now works itself out in the reality of undercutting a whole world. Okay, so if you have an entire world that's built on this hierarchy of social honor, where where you are in this whole range of what honor is owed you. And this is what your whole life is about. I mean, and the whole honor-shame culture was built around this notion that my self-worth, my identity, was rooted in the honor I received from others. Okay, and so you worked to achieve more and more honor. So what does the reality of Jesus Christ do with that? it basically undermines it all. You know, Christ gave up all of his honors and became and went to the very bottom of the social heap.
Yeah.
Where there was only shame.
Actually, he was off the social heap.
Off the social heap.
He was in the dung heap.
Exactly.
Quite literally.
So it isn't just a reimagined world. It's actually a reworked world.
Yeah.
On the ground, in real relationships, in things like money, in things like food, in things like hospitality to strangers, in all these ways. This is the reality of the gospel undoing a world on the ground.
Absolutely. As we've been talking, I'm reminded of what we talked about the last time I was here, the idea of sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
And excuse me. I feel like in the earlier part, Paul is talking about how your allegiance has changed. You have been liberated from the power of sin and death and bondage to sin and death, and you are now free to be under the lordship of Jesus Christ.
Yes.
And when he's pointing out how that works in the world, he's also freeing us from sovereignty to the social hierarchy and to the status quo. So sin and death are intimately tied up with that status quo and with that social hierarchy. And so when we talk about practically, what does it mean to say that our allegiance has changed and that we are no longer beholden to sin and death? Well, that means we're no longer beholden to the social hierarchy.
Exactly, 100%. And I think that's fundamentally what Paul means when he says, "Do not be conformed to this world."
Mm-hmm.
Don't buy into that system. Don't buy into that system in which everything is about what kind of honor you can achieve in the world. Certainly that is, and this is one thing I haven't dealt with much in the book or in these sessions, but the whole honor-shame culture was very much at the core of how society worked. And the gospel in some radically fundamental ways undercuts that whole thing. Yeah. All right, thanks. Well, here we are. We're in chapter 12.
I think this is a good time because we have a question that's relating back to, it's Barry again, Barry Reed. It's relating back to our discussion of study of Scripture and the renewing of the mind. And he says this: does the study of Scripture and the renewing of the mind lead the Christian necessarily to a particular economic philosophy or to a particular political system, or is it possible for Christians with renewed or renewing minds to disagree about the allocation of power and wealth in the world? Another softball question. Thanks, Barry.
I guess my short answer to all those questions is no.
Okay.
So, okay.
Does the study of Scripture
necessarily to a particular economic philosophy or a particular political system? Well, no. I'll answer yes.
A particular or a particular type?
I'll say a particular in the sense that the kind of economic system that Paul is offering us here, where your wealth is not your own. If we had another 5 weeks, we might go to 2 Corinthians chapters 8 to 10, where Paul basically unpacks, or let me put it this way, without coercion, Paul nevertheless undermines the entire thought that what I have is my own, okay?
Which is echoed in the church fathers.
Which is echoed in the church fathers,
and
which is echoed in church practice, in the book of Acts. So yeah, there is the undermining of a political system by the economic system. I'll just call it the economic philosophy of the gospel and the political philosophy of the gospel. Let's call it philosophy, okay? Paul is putting out a vision of life, which is what philosophy does. Paul is putting out a vision of economic practice. Paul is putting out a vision of political practice. Nothing is left off the table for Paul to think about in light of the gospel. Everything comes under gospel critique.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I'm not saying that this means that there is a kind of simple leveling of all wealth amongst Christians. But no Christian can imagine that their wealth is simply their own.
Right,
and that it isn't owed, if I may put it this way, that it isn't owed to others. More important, probably most importantly, it is owed to God, but it is also owed to others. And because Paul does use the language when he's talking about the collection. In fact, we see this when he describes his mission in Romans chapter 15. He speaks of the Gentiles owing it to the Judeans.
Exactly.
Okay? So,
So if I can
Yeah.
sort of maybe what clarify some things that might be part of what Barry's getting at. What you might not be saying is that, well, maybe I'll say it this way. What we tend to do as Christians is to say, oh, what Paul is saying is this, that's just like this other thing over here,
Right.
whether it's communism, Marxism, Leninism, Hegelianism, Platonism, Schleiermachianism, whatever it is, we get some ism and we say, well, they've already...
Economic conservatism, capitalism.
Right.
I mean,
and what you're not saying is that there is one of those isms that's the right one.
No.
You're not saying that.
In the first
because
place,
some
I
people
think
might
I'm saying they're all wrong.
Exactly. You're saying they're all wrong.
They're all wrong. Every system out there, every ism out there. It's not that every ism out there is just thoroughly evil, okay? Almost every ism, you couldn't have an ism that gets any traction in the world if it wasn't
Didn't
promising
reflect
something.
the world in some significant way.
If it wasn't offering something that looks like goodness, okay? And that might actually be goodness. But for Paul, no ism is left intact. Every ism, whether it's in whatever sphere of life, economic, political, social, cultural, whatever sphere of life, there is no ism that doesn't come under the radical critique of the gospel.
Right.
And must be reimagined in the light of the gospel. Which means then that Paul would not say, well, trust capitalism. That'll bring about good, the ultimate good in the world. Or trust communism. That'll bring out the ultimate good in the world. Or trust, the current market fiascos. That'll bring, or trust democracy. Or trust fascism, or none of these things are worthy of our trust.
Only Jesus.
Only Jesus is worthy of our trust. But Jesus comes with real claims on economy, real claims on political structure, real claims on social structures, real claims on cultural practices. In other words, Jesus isn't just a spiritual thing out there.
Right.
Jesus lays claim to our bodies. Our bodies need food. Call it economy. Our bodies share space with other bodies. That's basically what politics is about, okay? And social life. So nothing is left off the table of Paul's radical criticism in the light of the reality of Jesus Christ.
And because of that, we live in these various systems that are defined by our isms, if we will, as if not.
Yes.
Right?
That's right.
So Paul is able then to say, especially in the letter to the Corinthians, I'm able to be in these things now. I've been actually liberated within capitalism.
Yes.
I've been liberated within, if I'm in Soviet, or not Soviet China, if I'm in communist China, I'm liberated within that from my communism to be free as a Christian committed to maybe some things that end up aligning, but some things that radically are misaligned with what the goals are. And I'm able to be in these different social systems as if I'm not.
Yeah.
And so there he says, therefore I can be all things to all people.
Sure. And so the ism, you could say, that had a radical claim on Paul's life prior to his encounter with the risen Christ was Judaism.
Pharisaism, yeah.
Pharisaism, okay? So a fairly radical form of Judaism. That is not left on the table. That's not left off the table for a radical critique from the gospel, okay? Now, a lot more of that, you might say, gets saved than,
some of that is
from the
pretty
Gentile
well
world.
aligned.
Yeah,
but even there,
but even there, it's not as if in the encounter with Jesus Christ, Paul is able to kind of leave some of that over here, uncritiqued by the gospel, while some others get critiqued. No, everything is brought into the judgment of the gospel. And then liberated.
And to go back to the earlier point about the structures of the church that are not always of the gospel, if Paul were speaking to us today, I think there are some Christianisms that we have accreted on that are subjected to the gospel critique. I love that phrase that you've got, the gospel critique of all of these systems. But it does have implications for how we live, as you have been saying. So often, as I think you're speaking against, we hear people say, well, Jesus doesn't have implications for how I spend my money because communism was so bad in the Soviet Union, therefore any economic sharing therefore must be bad. And I feel like I have heard that quite often, not only in the United States, but also here in Alberta.
Sure.
And we have to actually read these texts and say, okay, well, maybe the Soviet Union did some terrible things and we should not emulate. But our wealth is not our own, and that doesn't come to us from any ism. That comes to us from the gospel of Jesus Christ.
And John Locke's theory of property rights didn't drop out of the sky or come out of the Bible. It didn't exist until he wrote that up during the Enlightenment, which informed all of liberal democracy and how we understand it.
And
it might be the most important piece of political philosophy in the modern era.
It informs all of liberal democracy, and it also informs the entire colonial venture.
Absolutely.
Colonialist venture, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay,
anyways,
let's move on. Because I'm compulsive about finishing here.
Yeah, and I want and I want you to. I want you to.
All right. I do want to just very, very briefly refer back now to the first 7 verses of Romans 13, because these are set within this wider context of the Christian social and political body in the world. Okay, so one thing I've had to emphasize over and over to students, and I do in this book. Many people read Romans and say, okay, I see now that Paul addresses the political stuff when he gets to Romans 13.
As though he hasn't been this entire time.
As though the entire letter hasn't been devoted to radically the question of political sovereignty. Okay? It's been devoted to the question of political sovereignty, and now he has talked briefly about the formation of this body politic in the world, this messianic body politic in the world, this social and political body conformed to the reality of Jesus Christ. There's the true political vision for us. And this is why Paul in Romans 13 has only these rough and ready and actually very negative and dismissive things to say about the ruling authorities. Effectively, he says they're there. They're there by God's appointment. It's not like they have escaped God's...
it's not like they're outside of this reality.
It's not they're outside of this reality. It's not like they've escaped God's lordship. There they are. Here's what they do. Mostly they do things out of wrath, judgment, punishment, sword, and so on and so forth. All of these things, which, by the way, are rejected by the gospel. Okay? So there they are. You got to acknowledge that they're there. But then get on, and immediately in Romans 13, verse 8, he says, but you know what? What really counts for us is this radical new reality, okay? So Romans 13, 1-7 isn't Paul all of a sudden getting political. No, it's his way of dismissing, of sidelining what we think is the most important political thing in the world, the ruling authorities.
Right.
Effectively, Paul sidelines them, says there they are, you got to acknowledge them. In some respects, you got to be subordinate to them. I mean, they're there. But listen, they're not the political reality you answer to. Paul doesn't use the word obey. The word submit doesn't mean obey. He's got another word for obey. So they're there. they probably do some good things. You know, they build infrastructure in Canada. Of course, they provide us with medical services and so on and so forth. So in that sense, he's not simply radically critical of them, but he does want to sideline the political authorities in terms of our affection, our allegiance, our obedience, our devotion, our trust, all those things. Paul wants to sideline them. And he does that within the context of a discussion where he is describing, in very sketchy terms, but nevertheless outlining this new social and political reality in the world, which we call the church, which Paul calls the ecclesia, or this gathering, what I call the messianic community.
Which, interestingly enough, in Ephesians, he does use the word obey in reference to that community. Obey each other, he says.
Oh, yeah, yeah. That's right.
And he also says to submit to each other in a pretty radical way. But,
yes.
But it's interesting, when you were saying that, immediately that text popped into mind. He doesn't say obey them, but he does say obey each other.
yeah, that's right. That's right. Okay. So I just want to come back because to that and just say that the wider political order is there. They can't be ignored, but at the same time, they are not worthy of our faith, trust, devotion, loyalty, obedience, and all those kinds of things. They hold no promise for the future. Here, Paul is simply not a progressivist. He doesn't think that everything progresses to higher and better realities in the world, and they hold ultimately no power over messianics, over Christians.
Which is to say, as soon as you said he was not a progressivist, was not looking forward to these better things, I immediately thought of that incredible Martin Luther King quote, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." But that doesn't mean that the governments affect that justice, right? So I actually think that King and Paul would agree that the moral universe does not equal the various governments.
I think you're right about that. I'm not exactly sure what Martin Luther King imagined with those words, but if we take the moral arc of the universe to effectively be defined Christologically and defined by Jesus Christ, I'm not sure I would say the moral arc of the universe. I would say from time to time, events happen and structures change and political movements bring about change that look more like the justice of God in Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. I am not at all convinced that history testifies to a progressively better
moral situation,
political, social, moral reality. I'm not convinced, for example, that 100 years from now, we will not have fairly radical chaos in the world for a whole bunch of reasons. Mm-hmm. Climate change and all of the radical upsets that's going to bring, increasing nationalism. I mean, we can talk about what I would call all of the other apocalypses in this world, right?
Absolutely.
That will inevitably bring about radical social, economic and political change in this world. Mm-hmm. I mean, we have the rise of the increasing rise of China as a superpower, with more and more influence in the world. Okay, the decline of the American empire, despite the fact that they still think they're the greatest thing in the world. So we have all of these. We have all of these things going on in the world that. Again, promise different things, point to futures that seem promising, and so on. But then we have also many of the other things going on in this world that are set to undermine the current social order and quite possibly bring about fairly radical social, political, and economic chaos. Mm-hmm. So I'm not optimistic, quite frankly. I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because Jesus Christ is Lord. So
he's a testament that God has not left us on our own.
That's right.
I mean, I think that I have said to you guys before, I can't remember if it was when we were rolling or not, but that's what I love learning from a Baptist pastor who had served in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. He always said, optimism is for the birds. Hope will get you through the hard times when you cannot imagine a future that is better than the present. And you look back at history and it was not any better. And for generations on either side, you expect for it to be chaos and horror. What gets you through is hope, and hope in something greater than this system. Whereas optimism, just blithely expecting things to get better. Because they gotta, I guess.
I know.
He's like, that's for the birds.
I mean, I fear for my children and now my grandchildren. What will this world be like? I'm not incredibly optimistic, but I am hopeful for them. And we bring children into this world because we're hopeful. Anyway, getting back to thought, Myron recently put up for his Facebook whatever picture, this
I did,
this painting by Paul Klee of the Angel of History, and there's this relatively famous German Jewish philosopher, Walter Benjamin, who writes about this angel of history. Check out Myron's Facebook page. But this angel of history has this horrified look on his face, and his wings are spread out like this. And what Benjamin says is what this angel of history is doing is looking backwards. There's this wind blowing from paradise.
Yeah.
But the wind is just creating endless wreckage in human. So what is this angel of history looking at? The wreckage of human history. And I mean, Benjamin is he ended up basically being a victim of the Nazis. But what he saw as the outcome of human history is wreckage. And I think if you read the first 3 chapters of Paul says, here's the problem. History is a lot of wreckage. And there are a lot of people who have been left in the dust of history, unacknowledged, unremembered. They're simply the trash in the wreckage of history. And this is what resurrection is about.
Yeah, and that's why Benjamin, channeling Paul, maybe was able to say every moment now in history is a moment through which the Messiah may enter.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Okay, so that actually gets us to the last part of chapter 13, because after Paul has just kind of effectively relativized and dismissed the political powers, he basically says something like this: look, Messianics, you live in the day. And by Paul, I don't think he means just daylight, okay? He uses the image of light. But I think he means you live in the day of the Lord. You live in the day in which the Messiah
may enter.
Yeah. At this moment. Be prepared, okay? You live in the day, the time of the Messiah, the time of the Spirit, the time of divine fullness. That's where you put your trust. That's where you put your hope. That's the reality in which you live, okay? So forget about the governments, okay? They're there. They'll do stuff, sometimes good, sometimes bad. Sometimes things change. Sometimes they get better. Sometimes they get worse. But your confidence is not there. Your confidence is in the one whose day it is. And it's the Messiah's day. And that's a day of fullness. It's not a day of emptiness. It's not a day of despair. It's that day of fullness and therefore of hope.
As you say at the top of 187, whatever is going on in the horizontal history of the world and nations is never separated from the nearness and power of God's liberating justice in Messiah. Things do not work out in the end because things do not have the power of their own redemption. Only God is able to bring about good in the workings of history, and he will indeed do so.
Yeah.
And that goes back to what we were just talking about in terms of optimism.
Yeah.
Things are not going to work out because they don't have the power to.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean that we don't have cause for hope.
Right.
I worry about leaving people in a pit of despair.
It's true. No. So finish the sentence. Living in the radical nearness of God's salvation, okay? The day of the Messiah, in which alone we trust. Messianics trust. Messianics or Christians are wide awake to the present moment. the kairos, and that's that word that Paul uses in contrast to the word chronos, which I take to mean primarily horizontal history. But in the present moment, the kairos, which is a moment full of both dangers and possibilities. Now, Paul does say, here are the dangers. You can dissipate your life away, right? You can just say, because in a sense, maybe Paul is saying, okay, possibly you think history is wreckage, and there was a great deal of fateful thinking in Roman and Greek culture. Basically, you live, you die, and that's it, okay? I was, what is it? I was not, I am, no, this is a grave marker. I was not, I was, I am not. That's it. Okay, and I mean, this is the consciousness very much of our age, right? We're here, and so what do? Well, you live it up as much as you can in the time you've got, and so Paul takes account of that. That's one response, okay? But there's another response, and that's to live in this, in the fullness of the reality of God's presence, nearness, liberation, freedom, fullness. Okay, to live in that reality is what is opened up by the gospel. Okay. Well, I want to get to chapter 14.
Can I just briefly?
Okay.
Barry sent another question, and I just want to mention he seems to think I said that property rights began with Locke, and I didn't. I said that Locke had a theory of property rights that defines pretty much how we all think about property today. And to oversimplify what Locke said that basically property was defined by changing something from its state of nature. So if you were able to change it from its state of nature, you owned it.
Yes.
And that's what I was talking about, Barry.
Right.
I'm very aware that the Old Testament has an concept of property rights. I'm very aware that there were property rights in ancient times and all the way up until Locke.
Although
but Locke really defined how we think about it with his whole ideas about what he called a state of nature, which was essentially very problematic.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, even in the Old Testament, you don't have, as it were, unqualified property rights.
Right.
No.
On the one hand,
that's not good.
Yeah, we won't go there. I mean,
but yes,
the land is mine, God says. Okay.
And if you don't give it its rest, I will take it from you, and it will have its rest.
It will vomit you out.
That's right.
And it will have its rest.
That's right. and the year of Jubilee is this reversion of property to their original owners.
Right.
And so there's this great economic leveling that goes on there. Anyway, thanks for that, Barry. In a sense, we get to something, well, not something similar. Okay. Paul spends the next chapter and a bit talking about what people eat. or how they're eating, or who they're eating with, or what they're, how. And so my line at the beginning of whatever chapter it is in my book is, I think my second sentence is, justice begins at the dinner table.
Yes. Messianic justice begins at the dinner table.
Okay.
I love that.
Because this, what is more bodily and concrete and economic and cultural and even political and social than a gathering at a table?
Totally.
It's this is, and we know this. I mean, we know who we invite for dinner and who we don't. We know who we're comfortable eating with. We know what kind of food we like. We know why we like that food because we're familiar with it. Now, we're in a multicultural age, so we all often like, ethnic foods too. But we know what home feels like often by the food that's on the table. All right? Anyway, but we also know what hierarchies at work. Who's sitting at the head of the table? I mean, Jesus talks about this in his parables all the time.
Totally.
Who's sitting at the head of the table? Who's invited to dinner? Who isn't? What happens when the ones invited don't show up? Well, then the other riffraff are going to be invited, and so on and so forth.
But I particularly love the way you link it all the way back to Genesis. And that the first act of disobedience and of injustice comes from eating food that one was not permitted or one did not have the right relationship with in order to receive. And
despite the fact that everything that they needed to thrive, all the food they needed to thrive was given to them.
I think often modern readers read that Genesis story and we think it makes God sound so mean that what was the big deal about it? But as I've read it more recently, and as I certainly read it in the context of this, it's you have everything. Why must you have this other thing?
Yeah.
And it almost makes me think about conversations about cultural appropriation.
Yeah.
When it's like, you have everything, why do you also need to wear this Halloween costume that is offensive to different cultures or is a caricature of another culture? Why do you need to have this other extra thing?
Yeah.
And that the idea that injustice and food are intimately connected, and therefore justice and the remaking of the community at the Eucharistic table is intimately connected with food. I think that's such an incredible connection.
Yeah. And so I just want to, so what's going on in as Paul sees it? This is maybe one of those places in the whole letter to the Romans where Paul touches down on what might actually be going on in the congregations in Rome. And clearly Paul hints at this a few places, but specifically in Romans chapter 11, there is this persistent attitude of Roman superiority towards Jews. Okay, and so the Romans imagine themselves as, I think, the strong, because they can eat everything. They're not worried about what they're eating. But there's those Judeans sitting at the same table, and they've got compunctions about eating the meat that we've got on the table here. They're not going to eat the meat. They're just going to eat their vegetables. Why? Because the meat probably isn't kosher, and quite likely it's been offered to idols. So they're not going to partake of it. But look, if they had a strong conscience, they would forget about those food laws and just partake with us. So notice there's this kind of once again a kind of Roman colonialist attempt to, as it were, wrap up the Judeans within the Roman picture of the world.
Right.
Okay, even if this is happening amongst a Christian group at the table of the Lord. Okay, so there's this attempt, as it were, to coerce the Jews into eating basically Gentile food. Well, once again, you have to kind of pick your way through very carefully, because I think this chapter has also been often misinterpreted. But you have to pick your way very carefully through this chapter to see, here's what Paul basically says. Look, when you Gentiles and you Judeans are gathered at the table in the fellowship of Jesus Christ, and that would mean anytime they're gathered together at the table, okay, because they're always in the fellowship of Jesus Christ. When you're gathered at the table, each of you must eat according to your own convictions. And none of you must force those convictions upon the other group. And what does it mean for the strong to build up the weak? What should happen in this relationship between the strong and the weak? The strong must build up the weak in their convictions about what they're eating, not try to convert them from what they're eating.
Reinforce their convictions as opposed to
reinforce their convictions.
Subvert them. Yeah.
Exactly. Rather than say, look, Judeans, get over your Jewishness, get over kosher.
Let me quote Paul for you.
Yeah, exactly. So what's fundamental here for Paul at the table, where they're gathered, eating and drinking together, is that mutual honor and respect, that building up of the other, that honoring of the other, as Paul says back in Romans 12, honoring of the other as better than yourself, that needs to happen at the table. That needs to happen when you're gathered in this bodily, social, economic, political event of eating and drinking together. That's where the justice of God in Jesus Christ, which breaks down the barrier between Jews and Gentiles, not to make them into the same thing, but breaks down that barrier, that dividing wall, as Paul calls it in Ephesians, breaks down that barrier between Gentiles and Judeans and enables them to come together and eat with this mutual respect and honor for one another. That is the justice of God being realized at the dinner table. Okay? That justice of God, which is destroying those things that divide people from one another. Yeah. So that's the upshot of chapter 14.
Yeah, and I really loved this statement on page 193 where you point out that the good news is that both groups, the Judean weak ones and the Gentile strong ones, welcomes both Judeans and Gentiles to the table. Sorry, or they're at the table. So I'll start this all over again.
Okay.
The good news is that both groups, Judeans and Gentiles, are at the table only because it is God's table.
Yes.
And because God welcomes both Judeans and Gentiles to the table through the Messiah's reconciling death. And that is precisely why that meal that they have together can be the ground zero of justice in the world. And you don't use
Exactly.
that, but I love that. Like it is the 0 point.
Yeah. It's not the sum total. It's not the end, but it's the beginning of justice.
It's the place where it has seed on the earth.
Exactly. 100%. Yeah.
It connects to some other stuff I think that I have around the Eucharist and the way I think about it. But this is one of the things I always say at our Eucharist here, with this table here, is that this is not my table, and this is not an Anglican table. This is the Lord's table, and you can come to this table because I can't forbid you.
Right. And I want to just pick up on something, and I'll maybe say something that you're not allowed to say as Anglican priests, but I'll say it in just a minute, because I'm not an Anglican priest. I do on page 197 make some translation notes that I think are important, but never mind that. So, I mean, let's face it, the Lord's table, okay? The communion table, the table of the Eucharist, the Thanksgiving, and so on, okay, has been, throughout Christian history, unfortunately, all too often a table of division. And who is allowed to be at that table is determined often by the strong, okay? And so blacks were not allowed at the communion tables of whites in South Africa and in the southern, well, probably in many places in the United States. And I mean, these kinds of divisions have gone on and on and on. Baptists aren't allowed at the Catholic communion table.
Neither are Anglicans.
Neither are Anglicans. But you know, here's one thing that irks me every time I take communion in my own particular parish. All those who are baptized may come to this table.
I don't say that.
And first of all, I don't. Were any of the disciples baptized when they gathered with Jesus at the Last Supper? I don't think so. Maybe they were, but we're not given any indication that they were baptized. Jesus was baptized, interestingly, and he says, "Come," and he invites. I mean, Jesus has an open table. There is so we've turned baptism itself not into this participation in the reality of Jesus Christ, but into a badge,
A boundary setter.
A boundary setter, some means by which we can exclude people from partaking of the supper of the Lord. This, to my mind, is wrong. I'll just say it. That's wrong. There should be no barriers to the table. If Jesus says, "Come," and it's very clear, and I think this is fundamentally important in what you said, so long as it's very clear that it's not me as an Anglican priest or the pastor or the denomination that is inviting you to its table, but rather that you, representing the voice of Jesus Christ, are calling in the voice of Jesus Christ all to come and dine at the table of the Lord, to participate in the reality of Jesus Christ. Who are we as persons or denominations or churches to say, you can't come? You're not allowed at this table. You're excluded. So, the fact that so many denominations do not have an open table, to my mind, is a frustration and, to a certain extent, a contradiction of the gospel. Now, I'll just put that out there. But I'm a theologian. I'm not an official priest of the church. So I'll just let that hang out there.
And I know you're familiar with this language, but I just think we have for so long tried to think of the Christian community as a bounded set, and then we start to use things like baptism as defining the boundaries. And so if you have a bounded set, then what's really important is you know where the boundaries are, and then that is so you can tell who's in and who's out. But a centered set has a defined center, and then everything is in relation to it.
Yep.
And that's what you think of. What is the relation to the center?
Right.
You don't think of who's in and who's out. That doesn't make sense.
Exactly.
It's like, where are you in relation? And some things will very clearly be out of relation so far that it's hard to define exactly what the relation is, except that it's not in relation.
And some of those are the baptized.
Well, and
some of that out of relation is amongst the baptized, while there are those unbaptized who are saying, I desire to come to that table, but I may not.
And I think this is what Paul is getting at in how he's trying to articulate the community, is that live in such a way that you are in relation to the center. And I personally think of the center as, if there's one defining thing about my faith, it's the Eucharistic table.
Yes.
It is, and if you go through the liturgy of both the Word and the sacrament, you have to go through the same baptismal covenant to get there.
Well, that's
right,
true.
Which is why, what I practice is open baptism every Sunday. If you desire to be baptized, come on up. We don't have anything out, but we'll get it for you.
Sure.
Because absolutely, here is water. What doth hinder me from being baptized? So if Jesus is calling you to this table, then...
Anyways,
we're out of time.
We are out of time.
I just do want to say that I do believe that the table at the front of the church, the altar, however you want to refer to it, this is the place where justice begins, and this is where it becomes concretely manifest in the relations of those who are gathered there with one another, and also in the relationship between that table and the wider world. So I just want to emphasize that. And let me just say one last thing. Paul moves immediately from the table to the universal lordship of Jesus Christ over Israel and the nations. Mm-hmm. That's the way he ultimately concludes the entire letter to the Romans. All of this is happening as a concrete sign of the sovereignty and justice of God in Jesus Christ, who is the Lord of the nations and Lord of Israel, and who under that lordship is gathering Israel and the nations to himself, signaled by the Eucharistic table.
Amen.
All right.
Amen.
I'd like to say more, but that's good for now.
Yeah, thank you very much, Douglas Herink. This is Douglas Herink. If you have tuned in late, we did get someone tuning in late who said they would like to know who all the people are as we sign off. This is Douglas Herink. He's Professor Emeritus of Theology at the King's University here in Edmonton, Alberta. Over on the other side of Doug is the Venerable Jordan Haney Ware, who is Archdeacon for Social Justice and Community Connection. I think that's the first time I got the title right. As well as Rector at the Parish of Good Shepherd here in the Anglican Diocese of Edmonton. And I'm Myron Penner. I'm the Rector at St. Paul's Anglican Church here in the Diocese of Edmonton. It's been a joy, Doug, to have you.
And let me just say thank you to Jordan and Myron for, putting out good questions, excellent comments, for reading the book so carefully and lifting out these quotes that you think are worthwhile to lift out. And I love your reparation comments. And so thank you so much for how you've contributed to this overall conversation and made it clearly more illuminating to those who might have questions and so on.
Well, it's been a joy, and I know I've received feedback from some of you who are watching, both within the parish and from outside the parish. And I'm sure you've been edified, which I think actually is the whole point of all of this, and built up in your faith in Jesus Christ. I want to thank you all for participating in this. Also, please know that that participation can go on. I know I was talking with someone who said they are unable to tune in on Tuesday evenings, but they've been doing so because they're up on the Facebook page as well as our YouTube page, so you can go back and look at them if you miss one. This is our final session, and we're wrapping up now, and I want to say goodbye and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.